More than half of all people affected by disasters live in countries affected by fragility, conflict, or violence, known as FCV. In 2023 alone, disasters hit FCV countries across all regions of the globe. Disasters and conflict are often mutually reinforcing. Disasters can exacerbate pre-existing social tensions. For instance, frustration at the slow delivery of relief after an earthquake in Papua New Guinea in 2018 caused a surge in violence. Vice versa, conflict can lead to increased disaster exposure and vulnerability. In 2022, flooding across Chad affected over 1 million people, with displaced populations more vulnerable to exploitation by armed groups. And conflict can weaken the capacity of governments and communities to cope with disasters. In Somalia, decades of conflict undermined the ability to address droughts and degraded farmlands and pastures. In 2022, the longest drought on record drove 6.6 million people to acute food insecurity. Climate change can multiply these threats, intensifying the severity and frequency of extreme events, and exacerbating the risk of conflict by contributing to water stress or food insecurity.
The World Bank has increased resources and engagement in FCV-affected countries, where 2/3 of the world's poor will live by 2030.
Over a 10-year period from 2012 to 2022, the World Bank supported 1873 lending operations in FCV countries.
This amounted to funding of use-only $143 billion, accounting for 26% of World Bank operations. Of those, 310 lending operations to a value of $29.4 billion have included some component of DRM. That means 17% of FCV lending operations have included some consideration of DRM.
Its FCV strategy promotes inclusive approaches that address the root causes of vulnerability, even during active conflict. Climate and disaster-related shocks are among those vulnerabilities.
GFDRR is a global partnership to help developing countries manage disaster and climate risk. It has responded to the growing demand for support in FCV contexts. GFDRR has provided 320 grants across 50 FCV countries. This accounts for 25% of all grants and 23% of all GFDRR funding. $153 million has been mobilized to DRM in FCV contexts. And experience confirms that in a world of compounded crises, a single hazard-based approach does not work.
The Disaster FCV Nexus thematic area helps the FCV strategy by working with disaster, climate, conflict, and peace-building experts and practitioners, as well as sectoral specialists, to adapt DRM operations to be FCV sensitive. The Disaster FCV Nexus is mainstreaming DRM in FCV contexts by capitalizing on key entry points in FCV engagements and adapting pre-existing tools for more efficient delivery of DRM in FCV settings. It is undertaking risk analytics and research to better understand the interplay between disasters and FCV and the operational implications. Because when FCV-sensitive DRM projects and investments are made, evidence shows it may lead to positive impacts over the short and long term, such as conflict de-escalation and peace. As seen in the post-tsunami response in Aceh with its peaceful institutional change. To inform the design and delivery of investments, we conduct risk analytics which explore the intersection between disaster, climate, and conflict risks, as done in the early recovery of Cyclone Idai in Zimbabwe, and to inform development planning in South Sudan.
A new e-learning course is available to all World Bank, government, and partners to better understand the disaster FCV links, with examples of best practice and lessons learned. Through our work, we aim to enhance disaster resilience amidst compounded crises.
Hello everyone. Thanks for joining us for this session here. This still morning, I think, yes. I hope you're more or less awake. I see a bunch of folks that I know have traveled very far. Jet lag certainly is haunting me, so I imagine it might be haunting some of you too. But thank you very much for joining us this morning. This session is going to be about 50-55 minutes. So it's a short insight into quite a complicated set of topics that interact in quite complicated environments. We have started to focus, you might have seen the video, you probably saw the video for a few minutes before. We've started to focus on disaster risk management in FCV context quite a while ago, with the recognition that an FCV context offers a different governance environment, a different level of vulnerability challenges, and those facts must be interacting with natural hazards, how we prepare for them, reduce the risk, how we recover from them, in some ways that are different from non-FCV environments. It's almost a yeah, of course. But even if it's a yeah, of course, there's not all that much we know from at least economic literature, even scientific literature, on how these interactions play out. So we're still really in a learning mode. Certainly we believe we're in a learning mode. I imagine many of you are. If any of you have all the answers, please share them, because that would help us get there a bit quicker. So we're trying to learn. We will hear in this session from two of the folks in our team at the World Bank that have done some research, trying to put some economic numbers, start to share some light on some of these interactions. We will also hear from two government representatives that are going to speak to how their experience is related to disaster risk management in some of the areas that are affected by violence and fragility. And then we will have some reflection at the end. So it's going to be a relatively short session. I hope it's going to be interesting. I do think we're going to have time for 10 so minutes of a few questions from the floor towards the end. So please keep your questions to then, and if you don't get to ask them during the session, of course, get hold of anyone that you think it's interesting to ask a question afterwards. So with that, I would like to invite Chloe and Bramka to deliver the first presentation. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So we all know that poor people living in conflict settings fare far worse than poor people who don't live in conflict settings when affected by a disaster. To DRM practitioners, this is intuitive. But there's no quantitative evidence to back this up. We don't know how and to what extent the effect of a disaster on conflict-affected communities is greater than non-conflict-affected communities. And what we were trying to do was to quantify that difference, not because the magnitude of the difference is important, but because showing with confidence a significant difference between conflict-affected areas and non-conflict-affected areas would help us better support poor people who are experiencing compounded crises. At GFDR, we want to establish the evidence-based and analytical backing to support this claim. So take, for example, Mozambique and Nigeria, two large countries that experience both disasters and conflict. We first looked into this question by taking nightlights data, because there's plenty of data when you look at it from space. It's not an ideal measure, but when we compared communities affected by a disaster that live in conflict-affected settings with communities affected by disasters that don't live in a conflict setting, what we find in Nigeria is a drop in nightlight intensity that is 0.9 to 1.4 greater for conflict-affected communities than non-conflict-affected communities. We used, as that example, the 2022 Nigeria floods. In Mozambique, we used the 2019 tropical cyclones Idai and Kenneth. We ran the same analysis comparing conflict-affected communities to non-conflict-affected communities, and we found a drop in nightlight intensity that is 2 to 2.3% greater for conflict-affected communities. And what this shows is that there's a significant impact on economic activity. We refrain from going further in the interpretation of this analysis. Why? Because nightlight data is not an ideal measure. We barely capture the most rural areas. Their economic activities don't depend on electricity and light as much as urban areas. There's a lot that nightlights don't tell you about the economic and social well-being of communities, especially marginalized ones. However, we needed to start somewhere. So this is where we started, and we were quite encouraged by the results. So what we did was to develop that methodology, narrow down in Nigeria, and go further in this analysis to try and see if we could corroborate this larger impact on conflict-affected settings with different data and analysis. My colleague Bramka is going to go into this analysis further.
Thank you, Chloe, and good morning, everyone. I am Bram Karga-Javino, Disaster Risk Management Specialist from the World Bank. Like Chloe mentioned, our first analysis started with nightlight intensity or nightlight satellite imageries. It does capture the overall economic activity and how the drop in this overall economic activity differs between conflict and non-conflict affected regions or places. But it does not capture actually what is happening at the people level, at the person level. And that's why in the subsequent analysis, we look into what were actually happening to the people. First, we zoomed into Nigeria, and we used the household survey data spanning from 2012 and 2018. And what we found is that in the first part, the first box you see, if you just compare households living in conflict areas and households living in non-conflict areas, those living in conflict areas experience almost 17% more drop in consumption. So even in normal situation, conflicts already play a role in decreasing people's consumption. And when we overlay further this conflict intensity, conflict factors with flood, what we found is that the difference increases tenfold. It becomes 150%, 152%. What it means is that if a flood happens, a normal household living in non-conflict areas, for example, if they would lose $100, for those living in conflict-affected areas, they would lose $252, or 2.5 times larger than those living in non-conflict-affected areas. So this further shows how conflicts and disasters, when they come into together, they amplify the negative impacts to the households much more significantly than just the flood itself or the conflict itself. As a DRM specialist or as a DRM practitioners, we are of course not interested only in what people lose, but also how long it would take for them to recover. So in our subsequent analysis, we utilize a micro-simulation model where we try to understand how long would it take for people to recover. So take on the left side, the blue curve. If a household is stricken by disaster, they would lose their well-being to a certain point because their houses are destroyed, they lose their assets, they cannot go to work. And then over time, they would recover back at least to where, or hopefully at least to where they were. Although in some cases, of course, they could not recover to where they were. The situation is different when we look into households living in conflict-affected areas. Initially, they experience deeper initial shocks. For instance, dwellings in conflict-affected areas are normally of lower quality than dwellings in normal area. And subsequently, it would also take them longer to recover, not only because they experience more loss, but also it's more difficult for aid to come to them. It's more difficult for them to get access to materials to rebuild their homes. It's more difficult for them to get back their livelihoods because of the conflict situation. And this, especially on the longer recovery time, is what we are evaluating using our microsimulation model. So we are still with Nigeria. We differentiate the states or the regions based on their conflict intensity, based on the outlet data, and then we evaluate what would the recovery time be if we take into account conflicts and if we do not take into account conflicts. What we found is that, for example, if you look at the regions with low conflict intensity, it would take them 7 years approximately to fully rebuild their assets. But then when we plug in the conflict effect, it would take them 9 years, so 2 years increase. However, on the other extreme, the very high conflict intensity states such as Borno, even in a normal situation, they are of poorer livelihoods compared to the rest of the country. It would take them almost 20 years. And when we plug in the conflict elements, it would take them, we found out it would take them twice as long as it would take in the normal situations. What it means is that it could be that for a typical Nigerian person, it might be that she or he could not recover in most of her or his lifetime. This is just the tip of the iceberg, and we would like to ask your opinions, your thoughts here, like what Niels mentioned at the beginning. Are we actually using the right methodology? Are these the base data that we could use or we could come up with to evaluate these additional impacts of conflicts? And what would also be the policy implications further after knowing all these facts? Therefore, at the end, we believe that we need stronger support for disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management activities, not even, especially in the most dire situations of conflicts, because people who are affected by conflicts and disasters, they face such a larger compounding impacts of both. So we really would like to advocate for stronger support for them. However, we realize that we need to do DRM differently. We of course need to scale up, but we also need to do it in an FCV sensitive ways. And for that matter, our group, the DRM FCV thematic group of GFDRR, we will have a full day session dedicated on Thursday to evaluate what should be done differently in various aspects, in financing, in sectoral reconstruction, in disaster risk reduction activities, and so on and so forth. But also important is for us to better understand if we apply DRR or DRM in conflict-affected settings, what would be the benefits? Because, of course, applying DRR and DRM in conflict-affected settings have their own challenges. What you build could be damaged by conflicts again. So, better understanding of this, better analysis, and especially because so far we have been looking into only 2 case studies, but not, and each conflict is unique, we need a better understanding of the benefits. So as I mentioned, we will have the Focus Day session as a follow-up of this advocacy piece, where we would like to dive more into the policy implications on Thursday. So we, of course, welcome you to join, and that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Chloe and Branka. So I would like now to invite to the stage a few panelists here. First, Dr. Mohammed Danjuma from the Northeast Development Commission in Nigeria. Please join us in the state. He covers or works on the part of Nigeria that has experienced the share of conflict over the last few years. I would like to invite Dr. Janito Maure, professor at the University Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique, to the stage, please. And also Dr. Ishizawa Oscar. Please join us at the state. Oscar, he's a senior disaster risk management specialist with the World Bank and has in the last many years worked on parts of the world that has experienced conflict as well. So with this group, I think I will pull the mic. Maybe I'll use that one over there. I think I will. Yeah. Okay, so first to you, Dr. Danjuma. How does disaster affect different areas and populations in Nigeria? And if you could elaborate maybe on whether vulnerable groups like refugees and IDPs and conflict-affected populations are affected differently than in other parts?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here. And while I was just watching the presentation by both Bramka and Chloe, it just resonates very, very closely with the situation we find ourselves in Nigeria, especially in parts of northeast Nigeria and currently in northwest Nigeria, where the dynamics of conflicts has been shifting and getting a little bit worse. While we are getting some reprieve in northeast Nigeria, it's getting worse in northwest Nigeria. So why I said it resonates very closely with the experiences we are having there, it's, as many of you know, in northeast Nigeria since 2009 has been experiencing some kind of insurgency, the Boko Haram insurgents that have been causing a lot of mayhem and damage over the last decade or more. And that has led to a large-scale displacement of almost 2 million people, mainly in host communities and some of them in shanties, in camps that of an already vulnerable group is further plunged into more vulnerabilities as a result of the conflict. And as you would know, the Northeast hasn't been the best of places considering the impact of climate change that has further depleted livelihoods. It's a mostly agrarian region, and of course, knowing that the Lake Chad Basin, with the Lake Chad used to be the bastion of livelihood, has completely lost its value of over 70 to 80% of what it used to be 20, 30 years ago now. So which means lots of people that used to depend on that body of water for agricultural purposes and fishing and the rest have been seriously impacted by the droughts. And of course, some of the impact of climate change, such as flooding, has also exacerbated the impact on those vulnerable groups. Yes, we have quite a number of people now living in camps or in headquarters of some of the local governments that have been, have been repatriated from the insurgents, but they can't go to their farms. So they are living largely on humanitarian aid and support from the government. But unfortunately, when, I will give you an example, when the flood hit in 2012, there was a huge flood that cut off almost 450,000 people for a long period of time, and very, very essential life-saving support could not get to them as a result of inaccessibility due to roads were cut off, and of course the conflict itself presented another dimension to the challenge for humanitarian support to get to them. So which more or less is like double jeopardy. They were already a conflict, an impacted group, and then the conflict further made the situation worse when the flooding happened. So that is a very, very one kind of example of some of the impact it has. And I think it took more than 5 years to be able to now see how we could now begin to work towards getting those people out of those areas to places where they could easily be accessed, because year in, year out, we started seeing that some of these floods kept repeating and happening. And the same set of people were getting displaced and getting cut off from life-saving needs. So it's really very, very, it's a topic that relates very, very closely to our situation in some of those areas. And I mean, once people lose their livelihoods, the impact is it's far-reaching, and of course, we know it has health implication and all those other issues that come along with the disasters that happen to communities. And we are looking at, a population of almost 26 million people in northeast Nigeria being affected by by these disasters and as a result of some of the conflict that has been existing in those places for a long period of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Could you elaborate a little bit about the recovery? We saw the World Bank economist research indicate that it takes much longer to recover in those contexts. Do you have any experience or any reflection on that from your context?
Yeah, so I'll take an example with Borno State. So Borno State is the epicenter of the crisis, of the Boko Haram crisis, where more than 2 million people were affected directly, and indirectly it has affected more than, I can say, up to 10 million people, because it spread beyond the states and even to other neighboring states where people were grappling with influx of IDPs. So it was a chicken and egg situation where we are faced with the challenge of providing life-saving support to displaced population, and at the same time looking to see how we could take care of the longer-term solutions to the problems that were more of economic development and building the right infrastructure that will be very resilient. And I know one of the projects that has been funded by the bank, it's the one that I coordinate, called the Multi-Sectoral Crisis Recovery Project for the 3 states of Borno, Adamawa, and Yobe that were most affected by the crisis. And I mean, it was a huge challenge to see how that will be able to, how that will be implemented alongside humanitarian requirements while laying the foundation for longer-term developmental needs that will take care of the underlying foundational causes. So we had to work very closely with the communities, with the state government, as well as other development partners to see how we could take care of some of the immediate needs. But it tended to draw longer, I mean, in terms of taking care of those immediate needs as a result of some of these disasters that kept happening. And a project that started in 2018 and was supposed to last for 4 years, we're still implementing it as we speak. And we're in 2024. I mean, that's to tell you how much it takes long to recover from some of these. It has had 2 extensions, one as a result of increasing needs, and then of course the other as a result of inaccessibility to some of the areas that were critically impacted that required some more attention for us to be able to, deliver the necessary infrastructure that will at least curb some of the repetition of some of those impacts on the population. So it's multi-sectoral, so we're working in health, we're working in education, livelihoods, agriculture, water and sanitation, roads, and all of the infrastructure needed, because I mean, we've had situations where not only did the insurgents blow up some very critical bridges that will allow movement of goods and services to some of the affected communities, we also had flood wash away some of the remaining bridges and roads that would provide the kind of access that is needed to support those communities. So it's more or less a double jeopardy for those states, and we had to scale up in some of the interventions we are doing. And just like in some of the projects, most of the projects of the World Bank, I know, twice we almost initiated the emergency response clause in the projects just to attend to some of those impacts. But I mean, it took longer. And thankfully, the project is drawing to a close now. And we are now working on a more sustainable and a more development-focused successor program to that called Solution for Internally Displaced and Host Communities in northern Nigeria, which essentially will build on the gains of the earlier MCRP recovery project that was more or less responding to the immediate needs of those vulnerable communities. So that is just one example I can give from the many I know I have have experienced over the last decade or so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to turn to Dr. Mara and ask you to share some of your insights from Mozambique on how disasters interact maybe differently across populations, I suppose in the north of your country versus in the rest of your country.
Thank you very much. So please bear with me. I think in Portuguese and speak in English, so I may take some time to respond to the questions, but I'd like to start by giving a context of the country. You saw the country on the map. That is 2,500 kilometers of coastline country. Of course, the majority of the population will tend to live on the coastline because there are more opportunities. Specifically in the northern part of the country, it's where we have the insurgency that started around. It's relatively recent as compared to the case of Nigeria. It started around 2017 or something, so we're talking about seven years. But we already have around 1 million people that have been displaced. The northern part of the country is the country that suffers the most the effects of tropical cyclones. That's the pathway of cyclones. So if communities are living on the coast, that means communities will mostly live on artisanal fishing. That is the case of the country. So if you have artisanal fishing and you have cyclones, in case you are resettled, you have to move away from that location and find another location to live. But if that resettlement is caused by conflict, you will look for safer areas, which mean those safer areas may not be on the coast. That means shifting the livelihoods of people that normally lived on fishery. They will have to learn how to practice agriculture. Then move inland, they learn, and in the process of learning how to practice agriculture, they suffer from drought. Let's say that one that happened 2023, 2024. So this is a compound effect. So it's that their vulnerability is increased, and in the time before they have learned to cope with the previous disaster, they are hit by a new disaster, which worsens, of course, the crisis. So we're talking about refugees, IDPs, that in some cases they are resettled to formal resettlement sites that are planned by the government, but because of the numbers that are involved, the government doesn't have the capacity to respond to all of those. Some of them will be resettled or will go live with relatives in places like Pemba, which is the capital of the Cabo Delgado province. So we are adding another layer of crisis. I mean, we are increasing the living costs of the host communities in the host sites. So this is a compound of effects that I just mentioned. We had, for example, in 2023, cases of droughts that affected not only, we are talking about northern Mozambique, but we also had people that had been displaced due to political unrest in the central part of the country. So these people as well suffered a second, I would say, suffering from a second hazard, which is a massive drought. So yeah, that has led to food shortages. So yeah, in a nutshell, I would summarize. I mean, the similarities are huge as compared to Nigeria, but yeah, we are recent in terms of insurgency, but we already have a huge number of refugees that are impacted.
Thank you very much. And by the way, your English is brilliant, certainly much better than my Portuguese.
Thank you.
Maybe a quick follow-up on this. How do you balance between, and we heard a little bit also before from Nigeria, some of these challenges between the short-term humanitarian response and the longer-term economic development efforts. Do you have some thoughts on that in the context that you're describing?
I would say yes and no. Yes, because I'm with some colleagues from the Minister of Finance, and they kept complaining throughout the flight. We had a long flight from Maputo to here, and they were complaining about the payments that they have to have, their resources, the unavailability of resources to support the teams that are working in the northern part of the country. So there is a lot of impacts. The problem here is while you are, the frequency of events does not allow the country to complete the DRM cycle. So while you're trying to recover from one shock, a single shock, you are hit by another one. So what does development mean? I mean, in this short time. So we don't even have the time to sit properly and plan for long-term developments. But it's a huge challenge. So you can imagine, for example, for the case of Cabo Delgado, this is a province which is very rich in terms of natural resources. But now we're having like high unemployment because people had to flee. They were practicing fishery and would sell the fish that they would capture and use that as a livelihood. But now they have to flee. They have to depend on other elements. So it's a lot of elements, a lot of layers that are part of this economic implication. I would come back to the fishing. The fishing represented up to 86 to 87 of the fishing GDP. I mean, the artisanal fishing that is practiced along the coastline. So you can imagine it's a huge economic impact, in fact.
Thank you very much. I would like now to turn to Oscar and ask you for a few reflections from your experience as a development practitioner working for a big multilateral institution like the World Bank, trying to support governments that are dealing with some of these challenges. A few reflections on, from a disaster risk management perspective, on that, what might work? What are some of the options we have to try to support?
Yeah, thank you, Niels, and thank you for the interventions. Also, I think I have very little to say after your experience. I will be briefly and then reflect a little bit more on the overall. I think it's a very complex question, and every time I sit with Karima to think about it, I have more questions than answers. So, but I think the team has done something very important, that is putting together quantitative evidence for understanding the impact of this convolution between conflict and disasters, and that's a very important step toward understanding the situation. They are looking at both economic activity and then also household level. I think we can conclude maybe a trivial conclusion that will be that there is a critical role and clear benefits of doing not only emergency preparedness and response, but the whole comprehensive DRM approach in FCV settings. So this also is very important, and when Branca shows some of the numbers of impact on consumption, when there is flood, household consumption, when there is flood and no flood, is a huge difference. So I think the benefits are clear. We have been discussing for a long time on several of the aspects. My question is this first phase that is more in trying to build quantitative evidence is very important, but my question as a practitioner, as Niels was asking me, is okay, we know this has an impact, but now what? No, what are the policy implications? How do we need to mainstream these into the policies that exist, or change the policies and support for supporting intervention or designing intervention? And I think we have at that level is where we have more questions than answers, and your experience is critical to validate a lot of the work that the team has been doing, and also to move forward and the opportunity to discuss on Thursday in a session that will be looking more at the future, what we do now. No? Then there are, I think, some limitations in terms of the data, of the analysis, and then some questions of what we can do. First, I think about dynamics of the population. No? We understand that this is a very dynamic environment, and then populations migrate internally, and then the numbers that we have maybe, or the intervention that we focus in a specific location in few months could be not the same location. So how to follow that, and maybe how to think about with you in terms of data collection and high frequency survey data to collect and to have a better idea and monitoring of this kind of situation. Now, I think in that sense, the projects that the bank finance in countries could include this element of data collection and high frequency survey data, no? That will allow us to try to understand these dynamics. And then I think, yeah, there is no magic formula, and the situation, the context is very important, the difference between the countries, and then how conflict is internal in the countries. But maybe the team, and with your help, no, from the field and the practitioners, is how, if we can have typologies to support other countries where we can try to recommend the policy interventions or physical interventions that could support other countries beyond the analysis that has been done now, and then looking forward at how the bank supports countries in FCV settings. No? So, thank you, Niels.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Okay, so we've heard from a few, from Bramka and Chloe, that at least now we can put some economics numbers that documents what I think most people in this room already knew, that it's harder to recover in a conflict setting than in a non-conflict setting from a natural hazard. But it's important to have numbers. It's important for development practitioners like Oscar and myself to have that kind of insights, and hopefully many more insights, to be able to appropriately allocate resources, engage, set timeframes that are realistic, understand what success look like. And we've heard from Mozambique and from Nigeria that it's rarely as simple or anywhere near as simple as the economists assume in the moment they do the analysis, because it's never just one event. It's the next event that happens before we've even gotten halfway into the recovery from the first event. So obviously it's much more complicated, no? And in some ways, I'm concluding development is easier if there's no conflict than if there is a conflict. So that's maybe not all super helpful. We do have a whole session on Thursday where hopefully we get a bit deeper, some insights, but we have 10 minutes. If there are questions from the floor, we're happy to take a few questions. It can be to any of the speakers. I see 3, that's wonderful. Will you be the mic helper? Thank you. We'll start over there, and then we will go here and there afterwards. So let's take a few questions, and maybe we can do 2 rounds. Go ahead.
Great. Hi, my name is Jeremy Vetterwald. I work with Impact Initiatives. Had a quick question for the Nigeria and Mozambique colleagues on your reflection on subnational geographies of conflict. I think we think of FCVs very much as a national level, but when you're looking at subnational level, you really see those dynamics. You've highlighted it quite well in northeast and northwest Nigeria. And I think that when we're looking at interventions in areas where there's still quite a lot of access, in areas where there are IDPs, it's still possible to do long-term programming. I wanted to see a bit your reflections or experience in areas with very difficult access due to conflicts, due to just lack of physical access, and if you had any experience to share to the group today. Over.
Let's take one more question here, maybe.
On this side of the room, maybe? Or
there's one here on the first row.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Katie Peters. Thank you for your insights. The findings at the start indicated greater disaster impacts and longer duration of recovery. And I wanted to ask, in your opinion, what's required to address this? So do standard approaches to disaster recovery work, i.e. we just need to do more? Or is something fundamentally different required? And if so, in your opinion, what would that need?
Thank you. Let's try to address those 2 first, and then we will certainly do another round. Do you want to go ahead? We need the mic up here.
All right, thank you very much. So let's, the two questions are kind of interrelated, if I may. And your question just reminded me of a phrase we coined during our intervention, and it became something we were using most frequently: changing tires on a moving car, you know? Because, I mean, the dynamics of the conflict kept changing, and just like I have mentioned earlier, at some point we were looking at an ideologically driven conflict in the Northeast that we already knew. Okay, it's about Boko Haram, it's more, once that is taken care of, and we could begin to do the interventions as it's required. But with time, the dynamics began to change, and it was beginning to become, at some point, more economically driven, if I may use that phrase to say, people who have been kidnapped for ransom, and people who are paying token to access their farmlands, and even some of the interventions by the humanitarian partners were being siphoned by the insurgents, and of course, criminals also got into the fray, because, I mean, when there is very limited opportunities for all, it's easy for people to now cash to do some of these criminal activities just to make ends meet. And while all this is happening, population kept growing. I mean, it's something that allows for one to sit back and wonder, So while you are trying to solve the problem in one hand, and I relate very, very closely with what my colleague here said in Mozambique, because you don't even have time to sit down and plan for the long term while you are trying to solve one area, another area. But I mean, we were able to now find that common place that, look, you do not wait, because the conflict does not have an end date. You do not wait until because you don't know when it's going to end. So we have to do both at the same time, and see how we could, create more resilient spaces and communities for those areas that have access, and create the incentive for those other places that are already enmeshed in the conflict to see that, okay, look, things could be better. And so some of those things required a bottom-up approach, engaging the communities very closely, doing a lot of work with them to see that the enabling environment is created for recovery, and then also taking lessons from some already resilient communities by nature to say, okay, what is it that's making those places more resilient than others, to see how we can replicate those and build on the gains in those areas. And one of the things that was very insightful to me now is the work that the team is doing. I mean, it obviously provides us a yes and no kind of answer to, yes, communities that are both in conflict and are also impacted by disasters, are more impacted in terms of it takes longer to recover and all of that. What do we do next? It's a huge question that we should all go back to, but at least it allows for us to now begin to what are the things that needs to be in place in terms of foundational blocks that we can all do on Monday morning for planning or situations like that. I mean, context differs from one place to another, but there are certain things that are common among the ingredients that could be a takeaway for us to plan. That will, in a little way, if not more, reduce the response time and the recovery period as we're learning and implementing at the same time. So it's a discussion that needs. I don't think it's a sprint. It's a journey that we have to be learning as we are moving along, and lessons learned from some of the things that we've done over the last decades, if well documented, could provide some insights into some of the things that could be mainstreamed, whether in terms of policies or in terms of standard operational procedures that could be adopted by other communities that may face similar challenges going forward. So, I mean, it's not one size fits all. Everyone knows that, but I mean, there are some things that are there are some commonalities that could be very, very important, because when you go from one community to another, you find that there are some differences. But on the bigger context of conflict, the impact is almost the same. And of course, responding will only require for the community to be involved in crafting those response mechanisms that will help address the challenges. Thank you.
Maybe Dr. Morrow, if you can address the second question on, is there anything fundamentally different, or you think there should be fundamentally different about disaster risk management in a conflict area versus a non-conflict area?
Well, I just wanted to comment a bit on what we mean by recovery for someone that has been displaced. Do we consider the access to basic services as a recovery, or do we consider his return to his original settlement as part of the recovery? Because if we consider that one, then it's very difficult to, define recovery, because the communities may want to access what they used to access in the past. So if they don't have that, they will not consider it as a full recovery, so an effective recovery. So it's just an addition to that. What can be done differently? I think we need collaboration. For the case of Mozambique, we have a huge support from the World Bank in establishing the so-called local committees on disaster risk reduction and management that seem to be very, very effective when it comes to DRM. So maybe for those communities that have been displaced because of conflict and now they're being affected by extreme events, we could establish sort of support the establishment of a local committee if they are not integrated already in a community that has a committee on DRM, and train them. Those could be the people that would communicate and would also allow us to gather data that is valuable for the work that you have just started. Because I thought maybe linking, for example, the lights with communities. For some cases, like in Mozambique, you may face a situation that a certain space was occupied by insurgents and the lights are still there. You may think that it's okay, but it's not okay, because the people that own the lights, they are no longer there. So that proxy that has been used is a bit, okay, I would suggest maybe you use like a cellular phone coverage, for example, but of course you have to discuss on other aspects related to, how the data sharing, what does that mean? Because you can track, cell phones by, the usage of network poles, and you can associate that with people. And if you had a huge community that used to be associated with a certain telecommunication but has moved, that means they have been displaced, that you know that is the people that can track and use, for example, the IOMs, the DTM, and try to focus specifically on these people. So yeah, that would be my initial suggestion for that.
Thank you. I think we can take one more question. I think
there was one in the back over there, or
I think.
Okay.
I know we're not covering all your questions. There is a session for a full day on Thursday. That gives us much more time to dig into a lot of these questions and have a longer conversation and learn more. So we'll take one more question, have one quick answer, then we'll wrap up, because then there's a plenary session starting in 8 minutes.
Maybe a good question to end, because I want to ask about the next steps. You spoke about the Ministry of Finance that you need to convince to spend the money. So in terms of the evidence, what more do you need? So what should be the next steps so you can convince the ministry to invest in DRR in the future, in these more conflict-affected settings in your countries? If you have a question to that.
I might have said it. I told you I was thinking in Portuguese, but okay, what I said was my colleagues from the Ministry of Finance were complaining in terms of the priorities. They have this amount of funding, which seems not to be enough to cover all the priorities they have. So they were complaining because they have new priorities arising like every day. So they are a bit in a struggle to allocate funds and resources to those places. So, yeah, sorry, I didn't get the last part of the... No, definitely this is a starting point. I think it's globally accepted. We need a thorough risk mapping of the country. We need to have that. If we don't have that, I will try to refer to one of the presentations I saw yesterday. If you don't have data, you don't know what you are managing. Yep.
On that note, I would like to invite Victoria to... She's a partner of ours. She's with the German government, German Development Corporation, one of the donors to the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery. The German government has been a strong supporter of DRM work in the FCV context, so no better among our partners to help us close out the session. Victoria, please.
Thank you so much, especially to the speakers. It was a great pleasure listening to your important insights and also for the great participation in the room. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some brief closing remarks. As Niels has pointed out, the nexus between disaster, fragility, conflict, and violence is a very important and very high priority for the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, or BMZ for short. And we took part in developing the GFDR's DRM FCV Nexus program back in 2018 as part of the Partnership Council, which used to be the consultative group. And so we're very happy to have this occasion today to see how the program is developing, to get an insight how it is growing, and also see the important insights it's generating, and especially also as demonstrated by the speakers, to see how relevant this work is to the lives and livelihoods of so many. So as mentioned many times today as well, this is just the beginning. It's the tip of the iceberg, and we need to build on it, and probably many of us will be walking out here with more questions than which we came in with. But it still shows us, crucially, that investing in these contexts, in prevention and preparedness in FCV context, is worth it. And as BMZ, as policymakers, it is this kind of quantitative evidence that we need to build the case and make the case for the nexus. However, it has also shown us how complex this field is, how complex the interconnections are between disasters, fragility, conflict and violence, and how they are still understudied. And we need to continue building our case by making connections and collecting more evidence and data to ensure our work is delivering the impact we aspire to, even and especially where it gets the most difficult, in the settings that are most difficult for us to access. So now we understand better the impacts and the magnitude of the impacts of disasters in these conflict settings. We look forward to continue working with GFDR as you look into the benefits of DRM in these settings to get a fuller cost-benefit picture. So thank you very much. for all of you for participating, sharing your insights. And please stay engaged, everyone. After the session, come to the FCV Day on Thursday. And I'm looking forward to continue building this knowledge base together. Thank you very much.
Just to say that that's it. Show is over. The end. Please, there's a session going on in 5 minutes in the main hall. We look forward to see you all on Thursday as well. Thank you, of course, to the panelists.